Boatworks Today is sponsored by Total Boat and Alexial Yacht Coatings, as well as supported by the generosity from the beautiful folks over on Patreon. Thank you so much.
So this week there were two things that I really wanted to accomplish here. The first one is I wanted to get this Armstrong bracket cleaned up, which means removing all of the 5200, so everything that you see in red, and well, pretty much everything along that face that you're looking at. So I want to get that cleaned up and get it prepped. And as well, along those lines, I want to go over what I feel are some pretty glaring misunderstandings or misconceptions when it comes to choosing the right material or caulking for keeping your boat watertight. Now, first things first, I need to get some material laid up on here because that's, once I apply it, it takes a little bit, 5-10 minutes for it to kind of activate and do its thing. And then while that's sitting there chooching, then we're going to switch gears and talk about the caulking. But first things first, there's two materials I'm going to be trying for the first time, new for me. And I'm not holding my breath that they're going to be, the silver bullet, that the 5200 is just going to come off, like a piece of cake. But if it can make the process easier, I'm all for it, because what I'm trying to avoid doing is getting in here and doing a lot of mechanical removal, because by doing that, I guarantee you I'm going to gouge it. The metal's going to get scraped. It's going to get all chewed up. And I don't want to do that. It's not the end of the world if that does happen, but if I can avoid that, it's just going to be that much less kind of busy work that I have to do. So the two materials I'm going to be using to try and soften up this 5200, the first one is a product that's made by D-Bond. It is their marine formula. And the other product is going to be this adhesive, right? Now, something that I thought was kind of cool is in the last video when I mentioned that these were the two products I was going to use. It's just they hadn't come in yet. That following Monday, I got an email from Charles, who is the president of the D-Bond. And, just kind of lighthearted, he kind of touched base, kind of introduced himself and said if I ever have any questions, whatever, to go ahead and either contact him or his head of sales, Rob. Rob has a lot of experience working with this stuff, and he does a lot of troubleshooting and Q&A with folks, as far as using their product. So I did that, and I think I've got a good plan going forward. So Charles and Rob, thank you for reaching out, and thank you for your help. I really appreciate that. The other product, the adhesive, now I think I ordered this through Amazon. So I ordered it, I paid for it. I've got no skin in this game, so I ordered the adhesive. The D-Bond was sent to me through Jamestown Distributors. So Kristen, thank you very much. You are a rock star as always. I greatly appreciate it. So what I want to do here is on one half of the bracket here, I'm going to use the D-Bond. And then on the other half, I'm going to use the adhesive and just kind of do a bit of a head-to-head to see how they fare. So let me get this material applied, and then we'll start talking about the side story. So the first product I'm going to try is going to be the D-Bond. Now, I'm going to take a couple different approaches when I'm using this stuff. When I was talking with Charles and Rob, I specifically asked them, I'm like, do I need to lightly score the surface before I apply your product? And they said it's not necessary, but honestly, I can't see how it's going to hurt anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one section and I'm going to lightly score it, and then I'm going to take another section, I'm going to leave it untouched, and just see if that makes any kind of a difference. Now, when I'm scoring the surface, I am not going to be taking the razor blade and going right back down to, down to the metal. I'm just lightly going to be scoring just the surface of the 5200. Just in my mind, what makes sense is that it's just going to help to kind of open it up a little bit. But I guess we'll see if that makes any kind of a difference. So scored, not scored, and I'm going to do that same approach using the adhesive over on this other side. Now, one thing I want to mention, kind of do as I say, not as I do. When I'm working with this stuff, I'm going to be using, I'm going to have gloves on, but I would also strongly recommend, because this is an aerosol, that you also have some goggles on. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any goggles, so I'm going to do my best rendition of a safety squint. Not recommended. I'd say if you're going to be trying this, have some goggles on, but the hardware store is closed, and I'm not going to delay things because I don't have a set of goggles on. Hopefully I don't regret that one. So now at this point, I'm going to give this a few minutes to kind of do its thing, and then I'll come back and give it a second application. I'm going to wait maybe 5, maybe even 10 minutes. So I'll see you in a bit. So today we're working with 5200, and this kind of brought up a question for myself, which is, why is 5200 so widely used? How did that become a thing? It just make sense. There are a lot of different options out there. How did 5200 kind of become the go-to or the gold standard when it comes to, sealing or waterproofing something? Now, taking a little bit of a step back, when I was first getting started on this, I took a job as a grunt at one of the local marinas in Bayfield, and I knew less than nothing, and that's not an exaggeration. So when I was being taught how to do this, I was told that regardless if it was above or below the water line, whenever you're putting hardware down, use 5200. And I've never been someone to just blindly do as I'm told. It's just, I need to know the why, and it's got to make sense. So I asked him, I said, well, why is that? I mean, there are a lot of other options available out there. Why are we landing on 5200? And I was told that it is a permanent seal. Now, not true, but I'm going to touch more on that here in a second. So now, when you're looking at a project and you're trying to decide, well, which material should I be using here? There's really only 2 questions you need to ask. And that is, one, what are the mating surfaces that are, kind of being put together here? Is it wood on fiberglass, metal on fiberglass, plastic on whatever, glass like window glass, tempered glass on something? You need to know what those mating surfaces are, because some of the caulking that's out there is compatible with glass or plastic. A lot of them are not, and that's kind of a big one to kind of figure out. The other question is, how often are you going to need to service this stuff? How often do you need to remove the hardware and reseal it just to stay ahead of the game? Because again, water getting inside of the core of the boat is kind of like a cancer, something you want to try and avoid at all costs. So through this process, there's really 2 things that you need to know, and I think that these are kind of widely misunderstood. The first one is, what is the usable life of, like when you rebed something and you put it back down, what's the usable life of that material? How long is it actually going to last? And generally speaking, figure about 7 years, from when a piece of hardware has been serviced. Depending on what kind of environment you're in, it could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less, but I found kind of like that 7-year mark is pretty much the sweet spot. The other thing, and I think this is probably the huge one and how 5200 became so popular, is that everybody seemed to equate bonding strength to how well it's going to actually waterproof. And the reality is that bonding strength has absolutely nothing to do with how well it seals or waterproofs. They're 2 very different things. Just to kind of give a real general example here, if high bonding strength actually meant better waterproofing, how did butyl tape even become a thing? Butyl tape has 0 bonding strength, and it is widely used in the RV industry, in the marine industry, probably a number of other industries as well. And at least the new formula, it works well. It kind of got reworked, I think, back in 2018, 17, something like that. The old stuff kind of sucked. It dried out and cracked, and it failed after about a year. But supposedly the new stuff, I have not tried it yet, but supposedly the new butyl doesn't do that anymore. So that's the thing. When you're talking about the type of caulking, high bonding strength does not mean better waterproofing at all. They're 2 very different things. All right, so let's just kind of think about this for a second here. As an example, let's just say you've got a piece of hardware that you need to remove, and going into it, you know that it's going to be fighting you every step of the way, and there's a pretty good chance you're probably going to do cause some damage in the process, either to the part or to the boat. There's a really good chance that you're not going to do it. You're going to turn a blind eye to it and move on to something else. Kind of adopt that attitude. Well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The problem is that by the time you notice that there is a problem, the damage has already been done. 10, 15, 20 years have gone by. You've got all that time of water getting in, saturating your core, rotting it out. Now you got a situation. So if you can avoid all of that altogether by using a product that's going to be a lot easier to service, you're going to be much more likely to actually do it when you're supposed to, right? All right, so getting back to the different types of mating surfaces here and using the correct compound depending on what it is you're trying to do here. Now, my general rule has always been if I am dealing with metal or wood or fiberglass, gel coat, something along those lines, which are really the three surfaces, or paint, the three surfaces you're going to be, kind of dealing with. I always opt for a material that's going to be easy to remove and easy to service. So a kind of a low bonding strength. I kind of grew up as a 3M guy. So my go-tos are going to be either 4000 UV or 4200. Now, I know this comment is going to come up. Now, a few years back, 4000 UV, 3M had a bad run. I want to say this is like around 2018, 2019, somewhere in there. Now, they had one year where they had a bad run and the material it didn't last. It pretty much failed like after a year. Since then, that's all been corrected. I personally have never had an issue with it, but it's well documented online that, 4000 during that one, kind of chunk of time, it had some issues. Now, because, the reason you want to use, or at least my justification for wanting to use a low bonding thing is because servicing hardware isn't exactly the funnest thing to do, and you don't want it fighting you anymore and making it more difficult than it needs to be. So low bonding strength, again, remembering bonding strength has absolutely nothing to do with how well it seals and waterproofs. You want something that's going to be relatively easy to remove, clean up, and then put back down. Now, if you're going to be working with glass, like tempered glass or a type of plastic, polycarbonate, your port lights, hatch boards, whatever it may happen to be, if any of the surfaces that you're dealing with happen to be a plastic or a type of, like window glass, these compounds, your traditional like polysulfite compounds, they're not going to bond or be able to bond with that plastic or that glass. It doesn't work. It lasts for about a week or two and then it slowly fails. The only material that does work well with that is going to be a type of a silicone. Now, silicone, it's kind of like a curse word in my vocabulary. Every silicone I've ever used just absolutely sucks except for one. And this is the only exception. It's the only silicone that I ever would recommend to anybody. And that is it's made by Corning, but it's their 795. Now you can use this like if you're putting, say, port light in, a lot of these frameless port lights on the sides of the sailboats. It's just a piece of polycarbonate that's just kind of, stuck to the side. The silicone will bond with the polycarbonate, which is kind of what makes it unique, but it will also bond just fine with wood, with plastic, fiberglass, metal, whatever it may happen to be. It works well. It's just, I don't know that it's something that I would use exclusively, even though it would probably work just fine. Silicone kind of brings up its own challenges, but generally speaking, if I'm dealing with wood, metal, or fiberglass, it's going to be 4000 or 4200. If it has anything to do with plastic or glass, then I'm going to be using the Corning 795. So then where does 5200 come into play? Well, it definitely has its place. It's just not in very many places. So for example, the two places that kind of come to mind is going to be your deck hull joint, right? Something along here. Most likely, this is never going to be separated. And if it does, you probably got bigger problems than having to deal with 5200. So your deck hull joint, that's a great option, again, because you're never going to have to deal with it. The other possibility would be on a sailboat if you're going to be reseating your keel. 5200 is a great option. There are others, say like if you're going to be using like a mastic type of, or a flexible type of epoxy, that would also work. But 5200, when you're seating a keel, in my mind, that's kind of like the gold standard to be using, as well as along the deck hull joints. But beyond that, keep it in the drawer. Just do yourself a favor. Use some of these materials that's going to be easier to remove and service down the road. Because again, usable life of this material is around 7 years. So you don't want to have this fighting you and making you work any harder than you have to. All right, so I have recoated these surfaces, I think a total of 4 times now, about 10-15 minutes apart. So basically, whenever the surface started to kind of look a little dry, then I came back and gave it another coat. Now, I will say, just visually looking at this, they both look pretty comparable. I'm not really seeing, one noticeably different than the other. In both situations, the adhesive remover is kind of melting the bottom paint, and I was told that was going to be the case. They said that for either of these products, they're both perfectly safe over top of like a 2-part surface, so whether it's gel coat or a 2-part paint. They said that it should be perfectly fine over top of that, but bottom paint, which is a 1-part material, as well as, you know, a type of like a 1-part paint, it might kind of jack those surfaces up a little bit. So, you know, going into it, probably the smartest thing to do would be, if you're not sure what kind of surface you're dealing with here, do a little bit of a test sample on an inconspicuous area. That way, if it does kind of go sideways on you, no one's going to see it. But do a little test sample first before you take it to a larger area where if it does go sideways, there's really going to be no hiding it. So, but this has been sitting for a while. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to be using kind of an oscillating cutter, using just a scraper blade. No teeth on this. I'm just going to kind of get in here and see how easy or difficult this stuff comes off. All right, so I could sit here and scrape away at this for probably an entire day by the time I do the tops and all the uprights and stuff, and clean off the bottom. But I'm going to spare you all that. Some of my initial thoughts here between these two products, the D-Bond versus the Adhesive. I think they both work. They both do what they advertise to do. They both started to break down the 5200, and they made removal a lot easier than it would be, versus just coming at this straight without any type of an adhesive remover. Now, as far as which one I would recommend, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but I'd recommend them both, but for different reasons. It just really kind of depends on what it is you're looking for. So the D-Bond, I think, is a bit more effective, quicker. So it started to break down the material. It was a little easier to remove. Didn't take quite as much effort. It had a good open time, so the surface or the product, it didn't evaporate off the surface. So you had a good amount of working time, and it seemed to work pretty well. The only thing I'm going to give it a little bit of a ding on, and I think that's just kind of the nature of this type of a remover, is that it does have a pretty punchy smell to it. You spend too much time in the shop here right now, and you're going to catch a nice little buzz, probably a headache shortly thereafter. But it does work well. So if you're in a situation where you're outdoors and you're looking for a pretty quick turnaround, start to finish, and trying to keep the amount of effort or chiseling, scraping, that kind of thing to a minimum, I do think the D-Bond slightly edged out the Adhesive. Now, that said, the Adhesive, it is a water-based remover. For the most part, it smells like you're washing your dishes. It doesn't really have a smell. It's nothing, in comparison to the D-Bond. So it has that. It has no odor. It doesn't seem to work quite as quickly. It does eventually, but it takes a few more applications. So, you're going to go through more material, more product for a given area than you would versus the D-Bond. And because it is water-based, the nature of all water-based stuff is that it dries quickly. So I mean, I had maybe 5 minutes and then the surface was dry. For both products, you want to make sure that that surface is damp or wet. Once the surface dries, either product really didn't seem to be doing anything more. So you want to make sure you keep the surface wet while you're scraping or peeling, whatever it is you're using to remove the material. You want to make sure that it stays wet. So in a bit more effort, it did come off. This side with the debond is cleaner with the same amount of effort compared to this side. But again, a couple more cycles going back on this, and I think that they would be pretty comparable in appearance. It's just a bit more effort and, well, it's just a bit more effort and a bit more time. But I gotta say, beats the alternative. Now, I know that this is gonna come up in the comments. Someone's gonna say, well, just use a heat gun and a scraper. And that, depending on what your surface is, like this is paint, what I would be concerned about is by the time you get that surface warm enough to where you can easily start scraping or chiseling off the 5200, I'd be a little concerned that the surface would be so hot that the paint itself could potentially start to bubble. Probably less of an issue with a 2-part paint versus a 1-part, but even still, definitely a possibility. With gel coat, probably not as much of a concern. If the surface of the gel coat gets too hot to the touch, you can burn the gel coat. It'll darken and discolor it. But with paint, that's kind of the reason I chose not to go that route here. Even though I am going to be repainting it, I don't want to scrape this back down to bare aluminum because that just opens up a whole nother process to get it prepped for actual finishing. So I'm trying to avoid exposing any bare aluminum as much as I can. So I'm gonna finish scraping this off camera. There's no point in me boring you here. So I think this is gonna be a good place to stop this video. So as always, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it helpful. And if you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Thank you in advance. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave those down below. I will do my best to follow up with you. And as always, I wanna thank you for your time. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful weekend. And I may or may not see you next week. We have company coming. We're still kind of up in the air as far as what day they would be getting here, what days are going to be here. So if there's no video next week, it's because I'm having fun with some friends. So until then, until next time, take care. I'll see you then.
This has been a Boatworks Today production.